The season of graduations and commencement speeches has begun. In 1965, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was invited to give the commencement address for Oberlin College. Now, if you don't know, Oberlin was founded by Congregationalists in 1830 upon the, quote, radical notion that slavery was America's most horrendous sin and that it should be instantly repented of and immediately brought to an end. The founders of Oberlin College sought to raise up Christian men and women to do that, who would change the world. And it was, in fact, the first college in the United States to enroll both men and women, and one of the first to enroll African Americans. So during the 1960s, Oberlin had a lot of students participate in the civil rights movement, and so it would not have been unusual to think that Dr. King would be their commencement speaker. So in the speech, he reminded graduates of the old story of Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. And if you don't know, Rip went up the side of a mountain, laid down for a nap, and woke up 20 years later, obviously confused why his musket was rusty and his beard a foot long. When he went to sleep, a sign on the little inn in town had a picture of King George III of England. When he came down the mountain, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. Rip didn't know he had slept through the American Revolution. And Dr. King told the graduating class, there is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And that's the great challenge facing you today, he said, is to remain awake through this social revolution. Remain committed, remain engaged to the promise of equality. And it was a hopeful time. I mean, school desegregation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act would become law just 2 months later. It was a time of great optimism for some, of increasing rights and freedoms, and for others it represented a terrible horror, the perceived loss of privilege. And so a counter-revolution was begun. And unless we've been asleep, we've been watching the slow but quickening pace, reversing those same individual rights, responsibilities, and freedoms. Dr. King made an urgent plea to them and to all of us. Please remember, all humankind is tied together. All life is interrelated, and we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. We are all tied in a single garment of destiny. I love that line. And it came to mind this week because of Tabitha. She lived it. Her life's dedication to good works and acts of charity was to literally sew garments for the poor widows, orphans, and anyone in need. She saw their needs tied to her own. Now, we don't know if she was a widow herself. We don't know if she was poor or wealthy. Some have speculated that she was obviously a woman of means to afford all of her work, but we don't know that. All we know is that she is the only woman in the Bible, only woman, explicitly given the name disciple on equal footing as men. As Wilda Gaffney points out, of the women in the Bible, Tabitha stands out, neither as a wife, nor a widow, nor a mother. She stands alone, named a disciple of Jesus Christ without regard to patriarchy or patrimony. Now, in addition to disciple, Tabitha has two more names, her Hebrew name, which means gazelle, and her Greek name, Dorcas, since they were Jews living away from Jerusalem, like Saul and Paul last week. So back to the story. Let's think about it. She was of such importance to the early church that not only would someone think to go summon Peter to come, but that Peter would drop everything else to come upon hearing of her death. Not to do what? I don't know, but we do know she's not dying after a long illness. Luke makes it clear, less so in the Common English Bible, but in others, that she got sick and died unexpectedly. And her body had already been washed and laid in an upstairs room. Mourners filled the room, those directly clothed by her compassion. They were not professional mourners brought in, as sometimes was the case, but actual people whose lives were woven into hers. When Peter arrived, as the story is told, he had the mourners leave the room. He knelt down, prayed, turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, saw Peter, and sat up. And he helped her get out of bed and called everyone back into the room to show that she was alive. Well, it's natural to think, of course, that she wasn't really dead. She passed out or was in a coma or something like that. But what happened isn't as important as why. Past the details. Why was this story told? But I have another question first. Who is this story about? Sure, Tabitha is named, but most people point to Peter. Look at what Peter did. Good job, Peter. But is Tabitha a passive object of Peter's actions? On the one hand, you could say, just like Jesus, Peter raised Tabitha. But wait, Tabitha was the one raised, just like Jesus. Dr. Phoebe Dickerson is a womanist biblical scholar, and she says, it is Tabitha, not Peter, who functions like Jesus. She sacrificed for others, died, and was raised. Tabitha was raised. Dickerson rescues Tabitha from the conventional, stereotypical readings of her as a helpless poor widow whose presence elevates Peter. And I just love it when somebody points out the obvious. Our years of patriarchal training have taught us to think that Peter is the hero of the story. Yes, but, and maybe that wasn't Luke's intention. However, he has already lifted Tabitha above the prevailing patriarchal understanding of discipleship defined by gender. So Tabitha is, though, of course, just one story in the larger narrative of Peter. But Peter is just one narrative in the larger story of Jesus and the narrative of the early Christian church and the story of us, you and me. Because we're all tied together in a single garment of destiny. All humankind tied together, all life interrelated, all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And it seems to me that Dr. King told those Oberlin graduates the meaning of Tabitha's life. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And yet, I'm afraid some of us will take the news of the past week as a single isolated issue that has nothing to do with us. How will this affect me? Well, just like Dr. King said in his commencement speech, let nobody give you the impression that the problem of racial injustice will work itself out. Let nobody give you the impression that only time will solve the problem. That's a myth. And it's a myth because time is neutral. Time can be used either constructively or deconstructively. And he lamented that the people who were against his equal rights have used their time much more effectively. Remember, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. But never as isolated individuals, right? That's why it's so important to belong to communities like this for collective action as well as nurture and support. Plus, we want to share these values with the coming generations. We can't do this alone or forever. The same's true with Tabitha. So I asked earlier, why was Tabitha's story told? The miracle was not merely the resurrection of one individual, no matter how important she was. Her resurrection was for her community. And her restoration was not a reward for her good deeds. It kept the community's post-Easter hopes alive. As I said on Easter morning, resurrection wasn't accomplished on what we call Easter. Resurrection was begun. Resurrection was unleashed, which means regardless of how dark the coming days may be, hope is never left for dead. Now, we may have checked the pulse. The body might be washed, the mourners called, but never leave the cause of equal rights, responsibilities, and freedoms for dead. Because regardless of our positions on various issues, there are some very important things we hold in common. If we are all part of a single garment of destiny, then we seek a mutuality of all genders, not a world ruled by one gender. And if we are all part of a single garment of destiny, then we seek to define such things as ethics and morality together as Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and people who have no religious affiliation as equal partners, not a nation which gives preference to Christians. If we're all part of a single garment of destiny, then we seek a world where supremacy is of love. Love of every color, language, race, immigration status, national origin, and more. Love supremacy, not white. And if we're all a part of a single garment of destiny, then we seek a world that does not define heterosexuality as normal, but which normalizes respect and self-determination and the freedom to define one's own family, and fairness for people of all abilities. And if we are part of a single garment of destiny, then we seek to ensure that whenever life begins, that life is ultimately fed, clothed, educated, cared for when it's sick, and loved unconditionally until its last breath. And ensure that women are not wombs, but humans with equal rights, responsibilities, and freedoms with whom we all share a single garment of destiny. And then we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brother and sisterhood, and speed up the day when, in the words of the prophet Amos, justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amen.